Alright, so picking back up where we left off in Symbolic Interactionism, a discussion of symbols and meaning. Last week we discussed the research methods, a general overview of symbolic interaction, what it means, the research methods and methodology, primary questions, major themes, subtopics, and we did some comparing and contrasting. This week we're going to review a bit more of the application, specifically in terms of your assigned reading for this week, a brief discussion of the major critique or critiques of symbolic interaction, and some future inquiry. Where do we go from here? But first we're going to do a couple of other things. One being some updates and reminders. Your second quiz is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. and your first activity will be graded hopefully by the end of this week with comments. So keep a lookout for that. And please watch a supplementary video added to this week's module and complete the Calarco 2014 article posted to the Week 4 module. And that reading is a PDF, and it's something that I typed up specifically because the actual reading is a bit longer. It's a bit more dense, and so I took out a lot of the extra information that isn't necessarily pertinent for the purposes of this course, and I took out a lot of the citations just to make it a lot easier to read. So instead of reading like 20 pages, this assignment was cut down to about 8 pages. So hopefully that's a little better for you all in terms of readability. But before we pick back up where we left off on symbolic interaction, and if we don't get through that, the slides, of course, are posted. But if we don't get through it during class, this will be a good resource for you all as well. But I did want to do a brief review of your second activity, and that's because I've graded about, I would say, maybe a quarter of the papers, and I found that I was leaving a lot of comments because I think it's important to provide that feedback and to ask questions. But I kept asking myself, am I leaving too many comments? And if I'm asking that, then the answer is likely yes, it's a few too many comments, and also that just makes it even more difficult for me to grade. It takes much longer to get through 10 papers than it would if I left fewer comments. So I think it's important to discuss this in class, or if you're listening to it elsewhere, I think it's important to review this so that these are some general comments that I would make or things for you to think about, but also so that you kind of know you have more precise expectations in terms of future activities. So again, the purpose of this assignment was to just watch some video clips and apply what you know about symbolic interaction to these video clips. And I asked 2 questions for each clip, and I wanted you to answer from a symbolic interactionist perspective, meaning you put on your symbolic interactionist glasses. These are the assumptions and the premises you have going into it, and given the concepts that you know and that we've discussed in class and that were presented in the overview on the assignment itself, I'm expecting you to answer it from a symbolic interactionist perspective and not just kind of give your own opinion or interpretation of the scene. I want you to answer it as if you were working as a symbolic interactionist or using that frame. And so again, the assumptions. Meaning is given to people and objects by the person perceiving them. And self-concept motivates this behavior, that a person's awareness of themselves in relation to others, as well as the ability to put themselves in the position of others, is a motivator for behavior. And then context matters, defining the situation. It's important to consider the relationship between individuals, and that this relationship between individuals and society is distinct. The premises of symbolic interaction. 1, individuals act towards things on the basis of the meanings they ascribe to those things. So when you were completing this assignment, I'm expecting you to also act on those assumptions that we just discussed, but act or answer the question in terms of these three premises especially, is that you're understanding that each person is acting towards people and towards objects on the basis of what those things mean to them, of how they are perceiving them, and then ask yourself, why are they perceiving them that way? Because meaning is derived from or arises out of the social interaction that one has with others and with society. So, of course, in one of the clips, let's say the Good Will Hunting clip, the blonde man approaches Ben Affleck's character, and you could perhaps discuss maybe previous interactions he's had with people and how that might shape his behavior. But you can also consider the interactions that he's had with other members of society or with society as a whole. So maybe like media programming being a big one, and the types of stereotypes that he's developed in his mind, or the meaning that he is associated with someone who looks like or talks like Ben Affleck's character. And finally, meanings are created and modified through an interpretive process. So again, going back to like the Good Will Hunting example, as you could have discussed, the blonde man, when Matt Damon's character began to speak and demonstrated his, this incredible intellect, perhaps the blonde man, he did still treat him poorly, but perhaps because of that interaction, it somewhat shifted or changed his view to some extent, whether or not he wanted to admit it. Because certainly what it meant to be someone who looked like and spoke like Matt Damon and Ben Affleck in that situation, the blonde man, those meanings certainly shifted a bit within that interaction. And that was kind of the whole purpose of the scene, is that Matt Damon's character defied those expectations. So the first two questions, the Hunger Game example, individuals act based on the meanings objects / people have for them. Based on how Effie behaves, how had the meanings associated with the reaping changed from the first clip to the second clip? Why? Consider how meanings change according to social and cultural context, from interactions with individuals and from interactions with society. First and foremost, make sure that you're answering all of the questions, that you're taking into consideration all of the things that I indicated that you should be taking into consideration. If you don't answer all the questions, you're not going to receive full credit for that response. And again, I'm not looking for the quote-unquote right or correct answer. I'm looking to see that you considered something, that you thought about something more deeply, and that you applied symbolic interactionist perspectives and concepts and terms to answering this question. And so, looking at this question, the first says, how had the meanings associated with the reaping changed from the first clip to the second clip? Well, obviously, when she first arrived, it was a very positive thing. She perceived it in a positive way, and that's very clear by the way she's speaking, the way she's carrying herself. She's smiling, and she's also a bit blasé about some of it, about calling a child, essentially, up to the stage to be a tribute in these games where the kid is likely going to be killed. But by the time the second reaping, she's very apprehensive. You can see the pain on her face. She's not excited at all. And a lot of you discussed it's because she developed a relationship with Katniss and Peeta, and that is absolutely important and something that I would want you to discuss, because again, like, her perceptions of it changed based on her interaction with these people, but also that allowed her to better see their perspective, to put herself in their position. Because prior to that, she likely hadn't had much interaction with people outside of where she grew up in the capital, which, as you can tell by how she's dressed, if you haven't seen the movie, is a place of affluence and extravagance and wealth and privilege. And so because she got to know Katniss and Peeta so well, she was able to better see things from their perspective. But finally, with that question, something you could have also discussed is how that changed her perception of the capital, and where she grew up, and how she saw the Hunger Games as something positive and exciting and entertaining. But because of these interactions, because of her experiences with these tributes, she began to see her own culture, her own society differently, as well as seeing the districts differently. The second question says, in the first clip, it is clear that Effie believes it is an honor to represent your district in the Hunger Games. By the second clip, what factors may have influenced her view of being a tribute in the Hunger Games? And so this question is not necessarily asking the exact same thing as the first question. It's asking about the symbol of tribute specifically and what it meant to her in the first clip versus what it meant to her in the second clip, and what factors influenced this view. So she once saw it as an honor to serve as tribute, to sacrifice for your district, to represent your district, for the good of all, I guess. And so what she once saw as an honor, she now sees as something horrific because she cares for Katniss and Peeta, and she sees them now as humans, as people who she cares about. And she sees it for what it is, at least from the perspective of those living in the outer districts. So what it means to be a tribute is no longer this great honorable thing where you can go and represent your district, but it's a death sentence. And although she knew that, like, intellectually in the first reaping, by the second reaping she really saw the humanity in it, like how it's so, like, this uncivilized, barbaric practice of sending children to die and calling it something honorable. And so again, this is working from a symbolic interactionist view. You're thinking about her perspective and her experiences and how she's able to put herself in the position of the tributes, but also what their relationship is like, the nature of their relationships, and how that influences her view, and the symbols, a symbol of something like a tribute. But then you're also watching these interactions play out, and you can tell, and the whole purpose is that she is acting, right? She is gesturing, she is making facial expressions, she is posturing herself in very different ways towards other characters, and that's important. Otherwise, she would just say, and now I feel bad about this, now I don't like this, but she never really explicitly says these things, but she conveys them through her actions and her facial expressions and her gestures. The second example from Mean Girls asks, meanings are continually created and recreated through interpreting processes during interactions with others. Considering Katie had only recently begun public schooling in the United States, how might the meanings with body image change according to the social and cultural context? What social and cultural factors have influenced the plastics view of body image? Here, it's important to compare cultures. So where Katie came from is very different from where she currently lives now in the United States. And I don't believe the movie, at least not in this clip, explicitly states where she grew up in Africa, specifically what country. But certainly those standards of beauty and the ways in which it's communicated are likely very different. And so considering she's going from one culture that has certain standards of beauty, particularly those that aren't Eurocentric images of beauty, and how specifically in the United States, how different parts of the body have been, like, sexualized and portrayed in media over time, and how that would influence if Katie had not been socialized in that culture, how she would not necessarily be aware of those things, and so those parts of the body would not represent that to her. She wouldn't necessarily feel those same pressures as the plastics feel. But also considering that she's coming from, like, a different economic system potentially, and how because we're sold all of these, like, products for, like, self-care and self-improvement, and how that influences our images of ourselves and how that influenced the plastics versus how Katie, again, hasn't been exposed to that stuff in the same way. The second question asks, in what ways did the plastics communicate these meanings to Katie? Examples like language, body language, gestures, eye contact, facial expressions. Well, first of all, they were all looking at their own bodies in the mirror, often gesturing towards those areas and indicating, like when Karen says, "My nail beds suck," she's looking at her nail bed. She's actively examining it. That's where she's directing her attention. And they're using negative language and explicitly naming the things that they didn't like. And they were all participating, like one after the other, which creates this social pressure for Katie to also to participate. And then when they finally pause and look at her, because she isn't joining in the same way, the same casual way that they are, they all pause and look at her as if they're expecting her to also begin criticizing herself. But she didn't even know what to say because she hadn't been socialized in their culture, so she didn't even know which parts of the body that she's supposed to dislike or that she's supposed to criticize. And so when she gives her answer, they're really confused because that's not something that you would typically be upset about or critique, at least within that particular context. So if you wanted to talk here about defining the situation, that would be incredibly important. About how within this context, of course, like, complaining about bad breath, that's something that everyone would likely complain about or not particularly care about. But within this particular context, it wasn't appropriate. It wasn't the answer that they were looking for. It didn't match up with their expectations. And finally, or not finally, but we get to the Good Will Hunting example. The first question says, the blonde man approaches Ben Affleck's character and asks him a series of questions demonstrating his skepticism that he had been in a class with the young woman. What are some of the indicators signaling to the blonde man that Ben Affleck's character was likely not a student at Harvard? Now, it's important to remember that the blonde man immediately recognized, before even approaching him, that Ben Affleck's character wasn't a student at Harvard. And you ask, why is that? And it's very clear that he knew it before even engaging with him. And some of you kind of talked about things that Ben Affleck said once the blonde man approached him. But the point is that he recognized that he wasn't a student at Harvard before he even approached him, and that's why he approached him. And so you could look at things like the clothing he was wearing, the way he spoke, his accent. His clothing appeared more stereotypically, you could say, working class, or at least laid back. Not necessarily particularly economically privileged, especially when we're thinking in terms of those stereotypes of someone who's attending an Ivy League university on the East Coast, especially at a place like Harvard. The way he spoke was less, Ben Affleck's character, the way he spoke was less refined, and his accent indicated that he was perhaps not necessarily well educated or not from a very affluent area or an affluent family. And, one example here is like how if somebody oftentimes in movies or, on television, if they're trying to show that someone's stupid, if they're mocking someone for being stupid, they'll often put on kind of like a country accent and, talk like they're from the South to indicate that they're not well educated and, not affluent and not well spoken, which of course is this, really negative stereotype. But that's what we're getting into here, is how the way people speak is an indicator of class, or it can be an indicator of class. At least it's what it represents to some people. Whether or not it's true, it can certainly be an indicator of where a person's from and their background. And he could also tell by his gesture and posture and way of approaching the woman, because there are certain rules for engaging, particularly in higher society. If you've been socialized within a particular group, a particular class, there are different ways of approaching people and engaging people. And perhaps that didn't match up with the blonde man's expectations. And plus, something that a couple of you noted is that the blonde man didn't recognize him at the bar, which he most likely frequents. So he could immediately recognize that Ben Affleck's character, was not one of them, because he was an outsider. Literally, this is perhaps his first time at this bar. He was not a regular there. He didn't recognize him as somebody who is typically around this area and interacting with these people. And the second question says, although both men are claiming to be students at Harvard, it is assumed that the audience recognizes that the blonde man actually is a student at Harvard. What indicators signal to you that the blonde man is, in fact, a student at Harvard? Why do these indicators convey that meaning? And again, like with the first question, we as the audience are expected to automatically recognize that the blonde man is actually a student at Harvard. And we know this because he's dressed well, stereotypically upper class. He speaks in a much more refined manner, which again is tied to class, or at least perceptions of class. His clothing, gestures, the way he speaks, his affect, and so on, they convey that he is actually a student at Harvard because we have certain expectations about how students at these schools are supposed to look and speak and dress and behave. And so even though Matt Damon's character demonstrated his superior intellect later on in the scene, which is obviously a requirement of attending a prestigious university, it's still clear that the blonde man recognizes this and still treats him poorly despite his intelligence. And so even though he is just as smart, if not smarter than this person, he's still treating him based on his perceptions of his background, of his lower class status. And so not only does he view him as of a lower class status, but he views that as a negative thing and something that should be ostracized. And in this example, it's focusing in on how Veda sees herself. And something that, for the most part, I think everyone answered this question, of those that I've graded, answered this question fairly well. However, there were some things that could be considered more, because again, we're looking at this from a symbolic interactionist frame and through a symbolic interactionist lens. And so it's important to consider the relationships that Veda has with these people and how that influences how she sees herself. And so when Veda asks Shelley if she thinks she's pretty, Shelley responds, "Yes, Veda, I think you're very pretty." Veda suggests that the boys at school don't think so. And so in answering this question from a symbolic interactionist frame, it would be important to consider that Veda is seeking input from someone else, someone who she trusts and who she respects. She respects Shelley's opinion, and she's asking her whether or not she thinks she's pretty because the boys at school have apparently told her or indicated that they don't think that she's pretty. And so that's, of course, influenced her sense of self and her view of herself as she's viewing herself through from their perspectives, and then asking Shelley to give her opinion and to give her perspective so that she can get a better idea of who she is and what that means. And if she sees, Shelley in higher regard than she sees the boys at school, this is going to be really critical and important for Veda's sense of self and how she sees herself. And so this interaction certainly influences her self-perception. And you can look at those verbal and nonverbal cues, like she smiles. It seems to be a positive interaction. And then she walks out to sit with her friend Thomas J. And he asks her if her lip is bleeding or if something's wrong with her eyes. And so again, like at first, initially, before she has this conversation with Shelley, she thinks that makeup makes you look fake. And she doesn't like it. But then she has this interaction with Shelley. And Shelley says, "I think you're very pretty, and makeup can highlight your features," and all of that. And, so then she has a more positive view of makeup, as well as, in that moment, a more positive view of herself. And she walks out to Thomas J., and then she sees it through his eyes. And it would be important here to highlight the fact that they're friends. There's a high level of trust and honesty built into this relationship. And so her interpretation of makeup then changes, and she's almost a bit self-conscious after Thomas J. asks if her lip is bleeding. And so here, too, it's important to answer all of these questions and make sure that you're addressing the why and the how do you know her perception has changed. And something that we talked about during class was those things we say in sociology a lot is things that are taken for granted. And that's a pretty common phrase, but by that we mean specifically those things that are so commonplace that they're easily overlooked. And not just overlooked or ignored, but just flat out not seen. You're just blind to them because they're just so commonplace. So those taken for granted things in interaction, one thing that I was noticing in people's responses to different questions is that there were a lot of things that were taken for granted. Like if I were saying, like, how do you know her perception changed? And of course, it is just as good to comment on the words she says, but it's also good to indicate, how her expressions changed, how her posture changed. And in the Mean Girls example as well, when they all stopped what they were doing and they looked at Katie kind of expectantly. So a lot of answers might say something like they looked at her expectantly, and so she decided to answer. Like she realized that it was her turn to criticize herself in that moment. But at the same time, like I might ask in a comment, like, but how do you know? Because there's so many things that are taken for granted in that interaction. Is how do you know what an expectant look looks like? How do you convey that information in an appropriate way? Think of it almost like charades. Like if I asked you if you got something that said teacher and you had to act out a teacher in charades, you would do very specific movements and, I don't know, say very specific things or whatever the case may be to convey to a crowd that you are a teacher. And it would be different, very different from the mannerisms and the things you would do if you were portraying a chef, for example, or a singer. One example I used was like this morning, my roommate asked for a ride to class because it was raining and she was brushing her teeth at the time, and she just pointed to me and then made a motion like driving. And I immediately knew she was asking for a ride, so I said, yeah, sure, like I'll give you a ride to class, but she didn't have to say it. And if you were interpreting that interaction and you were asked, like what happened, normally we would see that and say, oh, well, she asked her roommate asked her for a ride. But if you're coming from a symbolic interactionist perspective, you might look into, like, she made certain gestures that were typically associated with driving. She pointed to her, which meant that she was asking her for something, and that she also knew to do those motions because she knew how I would interpret them. And that's another important point here, is thinking about how people anticipate others reacting to them in relation to themselves. So let's say you have a friend who, for whatever reason, perceives your facial expressions to be, maybe like annoyed or annoyed by them or angry. And for whatever reason, they're perceiving your facial expressions like that. And so maybe when you're with that friend, you'll make sure to be more expressive, and maybe smile more or give, nods of affirmation that you're listening and that you're receptive. And because you understand that person is perceiving your, typical facial expressions or whatever as being, annoyed or whatever. So you might change how you are coming off to that person. And so here in this example from my girl, when I'm asking, how do you know her perception has changed? It's not just, oh, well, she said so, or she did this, and that's important, but you want to think about what it means to her and how her interpretation of the entire situation has changed and how she made those decisions, and how she made those decisions from her own experiences and her own perspective. And then when the final question here, how do the meanings Veda associates with makeup compare to the meanings Thomas J. associates with makeup? And why might their subjective interpretations differ? And some of you did, but some of you didn't necessarily highlight here. Maybe gender socialization would be a big point that you could discuss, and how children are socialized differently based on their gender. And especially because this is still a sociology class, you must always be considering those larger aspects of social structure like race, class, gender, religion, ethnicity, and so on. So again, when thinking about why are their meanings different, well, Veda's initially, like, she had one interpretation of what makeup is, but then she had this experience with Shelley, which is certainly the first of many experiences, where she's told that makeup is something that she needs to enhance her features, and that it's something that's necessary, and it's something that's only meant for girls, and how those messages are conveyed differently to children. So that would be a good one here, is to talk about gender socialization, especially in relation to the Mean Girls question again, is those messages that have to do with different parts of the body, which parts of the body can be criticized, can be sexualized, and so on, and which parts of the body are associated with beauty, and all of that, those different standards and how they're conveyed differently in different cultures, and made to symbolize different things in different cultures. And so for Veda and Thomas J, like, in terms of their gender, in terms of their socialization that's based on gender, it would be important to discuss those points and how their understandings of something like makeup is, their understandings are very much gendered. And then finally, we have the example from the Karate Kid. It says, individuals act based on the meanings objects have for them. What meanings did Dre initially associate with putting on a jacket, and how did these meanings change through his interactions with Mr. Han? In what ways did Mr. Han communicate this information to Dre, like language, behavior, facial expressions, and so on? Many of you did highlight on the fact that Dre initially saw this as a mundane task, but something that could have been highlighted more, something I think would be very important from a symbolic interactionist perspective, is that not only does he see this as a mundane task and then learns that it's much more than that, but considering his position as a child, he would be very much aware of the fact that he is a child, he is naive to many things in the world, he has considerably fewer experiences compared to Mr. Han. He also doesn't have a lot of knowledge and experience with martial arts, and so he's being asked to do this mundane task over and over, and from a child's perspective, perhaps he's thinking, like, is this punishment? Is this a trick? Is he trying to, like, make a fool out of me? And, so not only is it this mundane task, but I'm being asked to do it over and over. And, am I just being tricked? And is there something that I'm not quite picking up on here? And so understanding his position and how he sees himself in relation to Mr. Han, who is an adult, who is experienced with martial arts, and again, would have the ability to, like, if Mr. Han told him, like, no, this is something that's very important, okay, well, you're the expert, so I'm going to do what you say, but then feeling like, okay, I feel silly. This feels like a punishment. This feels like a trick. So really focusing in on, like I said, Dre's understanding of himself and his position in the world in relation to Mr. Han in this specific circumstance. And then afterwards, after Dre kind of lashed out, he was getting upset and getting frustrated with the fact that he was having to do it. And it's not just because it was a mundane task. That anger and that frustration came from somewhere. It's because performing, putting the jacket on and taking it off over and over, it wasn't just mundane. That wouldn't elicit that type of response. It clearly meant something else to him. And so after he lashed out, he recognized, in his interactions with Mr. Han, he recognized that he was being taught two different lessons. One is that Kung Fu is everything. There's always something to learn in everything you do. So he's being taught that even in the most mundane of activities, there is something to learn. And he was also learning how to defend himself. And so how do these things carry over into other aspects of his life? Is that it's not just putting on a jacket. It's not just reading a book. It's not just doing an assignment. There's so much more to the things you do on a daily basis. There's so much more to learn and gain from the world than there's so much more to gain from the world than just these mundane tasks. Like, it's not, the meaning is so much deeper than what is immediately obvious. And then he also learned how to use those motions. And when we get into the second question, that asks to describe how these meanings are continuously created and recreated throughout their interaction, I chose the scene specifically because it is such a perfect physical representation of how meanings are shaped in interaction. And that's something we've talked about in class, and I think it's pretty difficult to really understand what it means when we say that meanings change and are shaped continuously through interaction, because meanings, it's something that seems so stable over time. It's so stable, and they don't really change, but they do. And I think this is a perfect representation about how meanings can rapidly change and can come into being through interaction, because with every move in this scene, he's realizing that putting on a jacket wasn't just one task in and of itself. It's broken up into all these little pieces. And before then, those pieces didn't really have any meaning for him. It was just all lumped together into putting a jacket on and taking it off. And that's all it meant. But, or, and it, maybe it was an annoyance, it was frustrating, and so on. But once he's moving through the scene, and it's rapidly, these meanings are being created and recreated through his interactions with Mr. Han, is he's realizing that it's not just putting on a jacket or taking it off. It's all these individual movements that can help him protect himself, but can also teach him a lot about life. And so moving on into a couple of applications, particularly in relation to your reading for this week, and some critiques for symbolic interaction. And this is really focusing in on social class, which, if you haven't read the reading yet, it's focusing in on social class from a symbolic interactionist perspective, and how it has really tremendous and significant outcomes. So first, we have the presentation of self in everyday life. And so Erving Goffman is a pretty prominent figure in sociology, as well as sociological social psychology. And he used the metaphor of a theatrical performance as a framework to describe how actors present themselves to others, and how they attempt to control others' impressions of them to be seen positively or negatively, depending on the situation. And he focused in on how rituals influence social interactions. And so this could be like if you're meeting someone for the first time, they might have the expectation that you're supposed to shake their hand and look them in the eye. And that's something that they're expecting. And if you don't meet those expectations, then they might see you as not assertive or unprofessional. And that's a ritual. Rituals are things that we regularly engage in without thinking about too much, and it's kind of expected within that moment. So like shaking hands when you first meet someone, introducing yourself. In some areas of the world, in some cultures, when you enter someone's home, you're supposed to immediately take off your shoes. There's all sorts of rituals, like one being that I think is interesting is somebody sending you, a thank you card. And thank you cards, I think, are really important, but an interesting part of that ritual is how, let's say you send out your graduation announcements and you get stuff back from people. Typically people, it's understood that you're supposed to maybe send money or something back, or maybe you don't, but let's say some people do send you money or gift cards or whatever the case may be for your graduation, and you send them back a thank you note. And while that is wonderful and it's very important to show gratitude towards the people in life who help you, it's just so interesting because it's, it's a strange ritual, and this expectation of you expect to receive a thank you card for your contribution, but you don't necessarily do it for a thank you, but it's expected that that person send out thank you cards. And even though they've already sent out cards and it was your choice to send them, money or gift cards or whatever, but it's part of the ritual. You have to complete the ritual. And those can certainly affect social interactions, because if someone doesn't complete the ritual and meet those expectations, it often you can perceive them as being either unaware or disrespectful or rude in some way. And then proper etiquette for behavior. So Goffman talked a lot about etiquette. And so going back to having tea with the Queen of England example, if you're sitting and you're having tea and maybe a light meal with the Queen, you would likely be very self-conscious about making sure that your posture was correct, making sure that you were holding the teacup correctly, that you knew which fork to use at which time, and all of those different things, and how to place your napkin in your lap properly, so that you're fitting in with her on her level in terms of etiquette. And so etiquette is something that's very much talked about in terms of how to portray yourself. And so you might practice better etiquette in certain situations, and in other situations it might be much more relaxed for a variety of reasons. Again, going back to defining the situation. And then finally, how actors use frames to interpret reality and organize experiences, which is something we're going to touch on here in a moment, and it's related to your reading in terms of conceptualizing culture as a toolbox, so to speak. So Goffman talks a lot about impression management. Again, seeing interaction as actors on a stage, is that we're all trying to present ourselves in a very specific way to elicit a certain response from the audience, so to speak. And there's this backstage area too, where we can kind of let our guard down and behave in a way that feels more natural. We're not necessarily trying to put on a front and be perceived a specific way. And so, although society emerges from social processes, organized society exists before the appearance of all new members. And I'll admit that's an odd way of wording that, but essentially it's saying that society is stable, and symbolic interactionists see society as stable, but at the same time it's constantly being created and recreated through interaction. But also that society itself is influencing those interactions, and in turn those interactions are influencing society. And it's very dynamic, but yet it's stable over time. And with the introduction of new members, like when we were all born, we knew nothing, but we were socialized into society. We were socialized into our own cultures, or various cultures. And how does society remain stable when there's this constant influx of new people? Well, when you're talking about being born into a particular society or culture, you don't know anything before that, so you're not really bringing anything into it. You're just being socialized into those norms and expectations and rituals and so on. But let's say we have someone who comes from a different, society, a different culture, and what they bring to the table. And certainly bringing in new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things influences society, whether it be on the more local level or across society as a whole. That certainly happens, and that's certainly important, but it doesn't necessarily shake up the whole system. It doesn't just change the system because something new is brought in. And symbolic interactionists would say that this is because of impression management. And that refers to the ways individuals seek to control the impressions they show to other people. And so there are the impressions that you are attempting to convey, and the impressions the other person has of you. And so, again, it's not just the person, what they want and how they want to be seen, but they're anticipating how others will then interpret their behavior. But within that, they also have to define the situation and see what's appropriate within a given context, and anticipate how that will be viewed in the context. And that's because in certain contexts, something like modesty, could be seen as non-assertive. So, this understatement of achievement is meant to elicit, perhaps is meant to elicit respect, and likability, and you want to be perceived as likable and this and that. And in the right circumstances, it can certainly be seen as likable and competent. But if done in a way that's inappropriate for the situation, it could be viewed as non-assertive. And that goes too for ingratiation. Giving someone a lot of compliments and favors is might be meant to elicit affection and make someone viewed as likable. But in the wrong situation, it can be seen as, maybe that person can be seen as a suck up. And in the case of self-denial, if someone's kind of like denying that maybe they did something wrong, and they want to elicit guilt in the other person, if the other person defines the situation similarly, they might see the other person as worthy and truthful and, this and that. But if they recognize that the situation isn't how this other person is defining it, if those two definitions of the situation don't align, then the person who is in denial can be seen as a hypocrite. And so these are those common self-presentation strategies that impression management. And symbolic interactionists would say that this helps to maintain stability in society because we're not all necessarily acting on our perceptions in that process that's going on of perceiving and deciding how we want to act. We're not necessarily acting on how we feel or those impulses. Often we are trying to meet certain expectations of the people we're with or the given situation, and those expectations are determined by society and individuals within society. And so because we are compliant, because we are constantly trying to meet these expectations, it does maintain a sense of stability because we're minding those cultural and societal expectations in our behavior, because we're trying to create this certain impression so that people will perceive us as likable or competent or worthy or whatever the case may be, whatever it is we're trying to convey, so that we can function in society. If you do something that's too deviant, then you might be seen in a negative way. And so we all want to be seen in a more positive way, particularly like at our job, we want to be seen as competent. And so that's something we're constantly striving for. And so that would kind of begin to maintain or effectively maintain those greater structures. And so here are what are considered kind of the three biggest critiques of symbolic interactionism. The first being psychological factors. Often people critique the theory saying that it doesn't take into account individual psychological factors, people's personalities, their experiences. It doesn't take into account the uniqueness of each person as much. And it's generally seen as more of a framework and less of a theory. It's not incredibly specific. It's more of a framework that has inspired many theories that use the symbolic interactionist frame. It's also difficult to test. It's often too vague and to be able to precisely test, or even operationalize these, a symbolic interactionist, a variable through that lens. However, there are quite a few now studies that have done this very well. One of the first, I believe it was in the 70s, but it could have been even earlier. But this sociologist, a social psychologist, went out and I believe it's called becoming a marijuana user. It's something like that. And wrote this paper and gave this incredible talk about the social construction of feeling high, and which is really interesting, but it was very inspiring for the time because it let people know that they don't have to necessarily take it all so seriously, that it can be really important and really useful to explore kind of these everyday things that we might see as a little bit less serious, And it can tell us a lot about the world and a lot about how people work, and also too about how things can be socially constructed. And it's actually a really interesting paper. I recommend checking it out. But it talks about how like that feeling of intoxication or feeling high or whatever you want to call it is socially constructed, and it details that in a very precise way, and it does an excellent job of operationalizing variables from a symbolic interactionist perspective. So it has been shown that it can be tested, and it can be tested very well. However, it is often quite difficult, but qualitative methodologists have come a long way since the inception of this framework. And so there are a lot, it doesn't all have to be quantitative. It doesn't have to be measured and tested in a quantitative way. It can be done with qualitative methods, and there's certainly much more robust ways of doing that, but it ultimately comes down to how well you can operationalize the variables. And then finally, in the one that we're going to be focusing on, is the critique of symbolic interaction, is that it often does not account for macro social structure. And so going back to the explanation of impression management and how that maintains stability in society by maintaining or giving into those more macro structures that influence our norms and stereotypes and rituals and so on, and things that we see to be they're taken for granted in our culture and our society, and are attached to those more macro structures in society. Impression management is typically, most often, the way that's the explanation for it, that's how that occurs. That's how society is maintained through these interactions on an individual and group level. But nevertheless, there are still some major critiques and very valid critiques about how they often, it doesn't account for those macro structures, which leads into your reading this week, but also a really good example, I think, is the hidden curriculum. And so I'm sure some of you have heard of the hidden curriculum. Sometimes what the hidden curriculum is, it's the lessons you learn implicitly. They're not explicit. They're in no syllabus. They're not listed in any syllabus, in any guide, as these are official things that you are being graded on, or things that you will be treated according to how well you meet these expectations. Nobody, or rarely, people, instructors, whether it be in elementary school, high school, higher education, people often don't make these explicit, and but they're very much there, and you will be treated according to this. And I'm sure that's something that you have all seen at different points, is that there's this hidden curriculum, that there are these expectations, that you attend office hours, ask questions, or chat about the class, that you communicate openly with your instructor, you're expressing your expectations and asking for clarification and showing concern, while building that social capital. And these things also help build that social capital so that you're making connections. Perhaps it's for rec letters, for grad school or an internship, or a job, or whatever the case may be, and access to other opportunities like scholarships or research opportunities, because when you're making connections with your instructors, like, they're going to reach out to the people, not only do they know, but the people that they trust, that they know care, that they know want these opportunities. And that leads into mentorship, is that you can get mentorship from your instructors, from older students, from grad students, that is something that is available to you, and it doesn't have to be through this formal means, like a mentorship program, that you can actually build a relationship with your instructors, with your professors, with older students, or whomever, and you can actually build a relationship with them and kind of have this mentor-mentee relationship where they can give you advice when you need it. They can share with you their experiences and how that can be helpful to you, and maybe make your experience navigating higher education much more, much easier, but also much more profitable for you, so that you're getting benefit from that knowledge and that experience of others. Or something as simple as email etiquette, knowing the, quote, correct way of addressing an instructor, whomever, in an email. And so that being a big one is that I learned early on in my college education is that a lot of times instructors expect to be addressed by their title, and doctor, whoever, and typically you might get to the point where they say, call me this, and it's their first name or something, but they prefer to be addressed by their title, which I think is totally fine. Like, if that's something that you earned, you should most definitely be addressed as such. And so again, like, there's nothing necessarily like wrong with that, but some people, though, they do take it too far, and they do like get somewhat offended if you refer to them by their first name, or Mr. or Miss so and so, or whatever. They see that as disrespectful. And so, but if you don't know that, if nobody's told you that that's how it's going to be perceived, that you have to follow these expectations and meet these expectations, if you don't know that, then you're not intending it to be rude or disrespectful in any way. In fact, you might see it as more respectful because you're addressing them more on an equal level. You're saying, like, if you were emailing me, like, you're saying, like, hey, Christine, like, I'm having this issue. And you might see that as more of a sign of respect because you're trying to speak to me on a more, like, human and personal level. But if I were one of those people, that might seem like very disrespectful, and, how dare you address me in that way? But if you don't know those rules, and that's how somebody perceives you, and they see you as disrespectful, they will most certainly treat you according to that perception. But you don't know the rules, so how can you play the game? And then finally, formatting being a big one. And this is something that I didn't say in class. I kind of just got caught up talking, but it's very important. Understanding that formatting is key, and knowing the criteria. One thing that I learned through, and I've TA'd for about 1 million different classes in 1 million different subjects for 1 million different professors, and I've taught many classes myself, is that if you just get your formatting right, that's a huge step. Because if your formatting is all wonky, the instructor is immediately going to think that there must be a bunch of other stuff that wasn't done correctly. If you just do your formatting correctly, you're immediately going to be perceived as, like, it's more put together, you paid more attention to detail, and it's silly, right? It has nothing to do with the quality of your work or the content of your responses. It's like the least important part, but at the same time, it's that presentation of your work, and that's important in terms of how it's perceived. And so even if your work is outstanding, if the formatting is all wrong, it's like, yeah, but this person is, I don't know, maybe lazy, or they don't pay attention to details, or they don't, take this seriously enough to make sure that something as simple as formatting is correct. But nobody tells you this. Nobody tells you that that's how it will be perceived, because you might just think, but I got the work in, I did the work, it's good work. Sorry, I messed up the formatting, it's not a big deal. But at the same time, it is. But nobody's going to tell you that, and that's part of that hidden curriculum. It's not explicit. But also knowing the criteria. And so, like, learning to write a literature review. I realized at one point in my education that nobody had ever taught me how to correctly write a literature review. That I was just getting my work graded and not realizing that my instructors didn't have time to thoroughly comb through my work and give me detailed responses and make sure that I was using the correct citations, and that, how I was completing that literature review. And I didn't know that. But I know that some of my friends who were like honors students, like they got more time with instructors and got more detailed feedback and learned those things that I wasn't necessarily taught. It was just expected that I knew how to do it, and nobody ever necessarily made sure, as long as it looked good, no one ever, said, hey, like you could do this better, or you could do this in a different way, or here's how you systematically go through and create a literature review, because these things aren't explicitly taught. They're either assumed that you already know. Actually, all of it are things that it's assumed that you know. And if you don't meet those expectations, whether you're aware of them or not, it has a big impact on how successful you're going to be, and how much you're going to get from that experience. And that goes into your assigned reading for this week, the Clarko 2014 piece. And the big point of this piece is that behavior varies in the same situation because we possess different strategies for use in that situation, and we interpret situations differently, activating different strategies as a result. And so this is conceptualizing culture as a toolkit. And so again, thinking of that material and non-material culture and those things that you learn, those ways of thinking, those ways of doing things, what different symbols mean to you, how do you navigate problem solving, or whatever the case may be. And you can draw from those experiences to better navigate your present experiences. And so there's two parts to that, one being a strategy of action, which refers to the skills or behaviors used in social situations, and then your logic of action, and that's referring to the frames for interpreting situations, which leads into some of their findings. So the working class parents were using the frame of constraint, and so there's this constraint, and they're drawing from their own experiences without realizing that those expectations had changed, and they were teaching their children, be respectful, like don't bother the teacher, figure it out yourself. Like you need to figure this out yourself. You need to be responsible. And they coach their children using this no excuses approach to problem solving, and encouraging them to respect authority and to demonstrate deference to their teachers. Whereas middle class parents were operating through this frame of entitlement. And while that word is typically something that's seen as very negative, here they just mean it as in like you are like, I'm trying to think of a better word, but like not necessarily like you're entitled, like I'm owed this, but like this is something that I am allowed to ask, and I'm a student at this school, and the teacher is here to teach me, and I am entitled to ask questions. I am entitled to ask for help. And so the middle class parents were then, because they were connected in the school, because they had had some different experiences, and they, were able to engage more often with teachers, they recognized that those expectations from teachers had changed over time and were not like their experiences when they were in school. And they used that capital to then coach their children to use this by any means approach to problem solving, which was urging children to negotiate with teachers for assistance and ask for help. And again, this is because parents' relationships with the school varied by social class and shaped their beliefs about teachers' behavioral expectations. And one of the reasons why they varied by class is because the middle class parents often had more time to either take off work and participate in school events or contribute to school fundraisers, or perhaps one or both parents was working from home, or one parent didn't work and was able to be much more involved with the school and much more involved with their children's education, and so they're interacting with the teachers more and other parents, and they're much more aware of how to navigate the school system and how to advocate for their kids, how to get them the resources that they needed to be successful. And so they taught their children to advocate for themselves and to ask questions when they were unsure, to raise their hands and ask for help, and that it was okay to ask for help. And one of the examples used in the reading is this little girl and this little boy, and it was like they were having an outside day, and they were launching rockets they'd built in class. And the little boy, he was middle class, and his mother was able to come and watch him successfully launch his rocket. And there was a little girl from a working class family, and her parents were working, so they were unable to attend this school event because it was during school hours. And both children, a little string broke on their rocket. And the little girl walked over and sat down, and she immediately began trying to fix it herself and trying to figure it out herself. And the little boy ran over to his mom and, said that he needed some help. And she was like, go ask the teacher. And the teacher was like, yeah, sure. And immediately grabbed an extra string that wasn't broken and attached it to the rocket. And he was able to launch his 3, 4, 5 times. And the little girl, although she got the benefit of having to sit down and figure out how to fix it herself, which is great, she only got to launch her rocket 1 or 2 times at most. And so she didn't get to have that experience that he did. There was this disparity in their experience. He got to do it twice as many times as she did. And although she got the benefit of having to sit down and figure it out for herself, it was really frustrating, and she didn't get to experience the success of launching her rocket or the feeling associated with that success as many times as he did. And so it was a very different experience. And his problem solving was he immediately went and asked for help, and it was done much more quickly and efficiently, and he saw somebody do it the correct way, somebody fix it and actually make it where it's not going to break again, where it's going to, launch correctly and fly straight or whatever. And the little girl was just trying to make do for herself, when it would have been much easier and much more effective if she were able to get a replacement string. And so it's not necessarily saying that one way is the good way and one way is the bad way. It's just saying that you do see these differences in results. And this is something that I also see in class, and I see it. So I used to teach tumbling before I started this program. I taught tumbling for a long time to mostly little kids, the tiny tot class, but the class where you could really see this were the kids who were between the ages of 6 and 8. And some kids would always, if they were having trouble with something, they would always ask for help. And they would ask me to watch them and critique them. And I would. And then there were other kids who were so great. They listened so well. They were just wonderful. They worked hard, but they never asked for help. They never asked me to critique them and to watch them perform their skill. And I realized after some time that the kids who were asking for help are getting so much one-on-one attention. Their form, their technique is great because I'm spending this extra time with them, watching them individually and critiquing them, whereas other kids are trying to figure it out for themselves, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable asking for help or asking me to devote my time and energy and attention to just them. They felt like that was selfish, asking me to step away from other kids to contribute to their learning and their success. And so that was something that I actively tried to change. But I still see this which it was much easier to change there than it is in a college environment, because I see that here, is that some students are so good at communicating and asking for what they need. A lesson I learned a few years ago was somebody told me, you don't get what you don't ask for. And to this day, it was never something that occurred to me. I never thought that I was entitled to ask anyone for anything. That let's say I missed an assignment or whatever, or I got a 0 on something that I thought I turned in, and instead of just immediately asking the teacher hey, what's going on? Why did I get this grade? I would, comb through emails and my submission history and make sure that I turned the correct thing in at the correct time in the correct place. And then, maybe I made a mistake and turned in the wrong file or didn't click submit or whatever, then I would reach out to the teacher and say, hey, like, I'm sorry, like, this is what happened, like, I apologize, it won't happen again, but, like, I did it, I completed the work, instead of just, like, immediately reaching out and be like, hey, like, what's the deal, what's going on, why did I get this grade, or, like, needing more time on something. I never knew that I could just ask. I thought that, like, if I didn't turn something in, like, that's that. That was the due date, those are the rules, and I didn't meet them, and so I just have to suffer the consequences, instead of saying, like, hey, could I get some more time to work on this? And oftentimes, your instructor will say, yes, of course, as long as you do the work, like, you can have an extra day or so, and, maybe we can talk about some things that you're still unsure about to help get you started, or, whatever. It never occurred to me that I could just ask. And even in this classroom and in other classrooms that I've been in, there are students who they're advocate for themselves. They have no issues with asking for help, for saying they don't understand something, they need more time. They make their expectations very clear. They communicate to me what's going on, and I accommodate them. I try to accommodate them. But then there's students who they might be having difficulties, and they just don't communicate. And when I do reach out, they're like, well, this is going on and that's going on and this is the case. And I'm like, well, I just wish you would have told me. Like, I wish you would just communicate with me, and I'll try to help. And that's why in my syllabus I try to put things like, attend office hours, or just all you have to do is communicate with me. As long as you communicate, you're good. But again, going back to that hidden curriculum, it's not something that's explicitly taught, and it's very much tied to things like class and socioeconomic status and your educational background, and all of those things that are a part of the social structure. That's how they influence our interactions here on an individual level within the institution of higher education. That's how those particular things influence our interactions here, and in ways that are not always easily recognized. We don't always see how class results in these very different outcomes among students, because the students who are most successful are often the students who are able to make connections, are able to ask for help, and that being something that's often very much tied to class and your background, that's how it not only shapes our interactions, but it shapes outcomes. And so that's something that we'll be discussing much more when we get into the section on identity. And so be thinking of that, be thinking about those more macro level structures and how they influence our interactions here on the individual level, and how our interactions here on the individual level affect those more macro structures, and the messages that we are socialized to believe to be true, stereotypes that are communicated to us and expressed to us through other cultural items, perhaps like the media, for example, because when there are these outcomes that are related to greater structures, like there's outcomes on the individual level that are related to something like class, that very much goes on to reinforce those existing beliefs about class and status. So be thinking about that, and we will pick back up on identity next week. And don't forget to watch the supplementary video for this week and complete, it says quiz 1, but it's quiz 2, I'm sorry. So don't forget to complete quiz 2.